The twisted metal corridors of the mining station, Kerberos 7, echoed with screams that would haunt even the most hardened Imperial Guard veteran. Deep within the bowels of an ancient space hulk that had drifted through the warp for millennia, something stirred, something that had been waiting in the darkness between stars, patient as death itself. The mining crews had thought they were extracting precious adamantium ore from the derelict vessel's hull. They had no idea they were about to unleash a nightmare that would make the horrors of the warp seem like children's bedtime stories. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, humanity faces countless threats. Ork hordes crash through the void seeking endless battle. Tyranid hive fleets devour entire star systems. Chaos legions tear reality apart with their blasphemous rituals. But what happens when the galaxy's apex predator encounters something even more perfectly evolved for slaughter? What occurs when the universe's most efficient killing machine meets creatures that exist for no other purpose than to hunt, reproduce, and spread their deadly spawn across the stars? Today, we're diving deep into one of the most terrifying scenarios imaginable. We're exploring what would happen if xenomorphs, those biomechanical nightmares from the deepest reaches of space, invaded the already hellish universe of Warhammer 40 Kelvins. This isn't just about two fictional universes colliding. This is about examining what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. When perfect organisms designed solely for killing encounter a galaxy already drowning in endless war. The implications are staggering. We're talking about creatures that can adapt to any environment, learn from every encounter, and turn their victims into breeding stock for even more deadly offspring. Imagine these horrors spreading through hive cities containing billions of souls. Picture them infiltrating space marine chapters, using the enhanced genetics of the Emperor's finest warriors to create even more terrifying hybrid spawn. Consider the chaos that would erupt if they reached Terra itself, the throne world of the God Emperor of mankind. But here's what makes this scenario truly fascinating. The Warhammer 40 Kelvins universe isn't some peaceful utopia ripe for conquest. It's a realm where every single day brings fresh horrors that would shatter the minds of lesser beings. The Imperial Guard faces down demonic incursions with nothing but faith and lasguns. Space Marines routinely battle enemies that exist partially outside reality itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus creates technological horrors that blur the line between flesh and machine. This is a universe that has survived 10,000 years of constant warfare against threats that defy comprehension. So what happens when xenomorphs enter this crucible of endless conflict? Do they become just another Xenos threat to be purged by bolter, fire, and flamer? Or do they represent something far more dangerous? Something that could potentially tip the balance in the galaxy's eternal struggle between order and chaos? The answer lies in understanding exactly what makes xenomorphs so terrifyingly effective. These aren't just monsters, they're biological weapons perfected through millions of years of evolution. Every aspect of their existence serves a single purpose: to hunt, kill, and reproduce. Their acid blood makes them nearly impossible to kill without specialized equipment. Their ability to survive in the vacuum of space means no environment is safe from their presence. Most terrifyingly, they can use the genetic material of their hosts to create new variations perfectly adapted to overcome specific threats. In the 40 Kelvins universe, this adaptive capability becomes absolutely nightmarish. Imagine a xenomorph that has used an orc as its host. The resulting creature would possess not only the xenomorph's natural hunting instincts, but also the orc's incredible resilience and love of violence. Picture the horror of a xenomorph spawned from a space marine, combining the alien's perfect killing efficiency with the transhuman strength and tactical knowledge of the Adeptus Astartes. Consider the implications of a xenomorph that has absorbed the psychic potential of an Imperial Psyker, gaining the ability to manipulate the warp itself. But the true terror begins when we consider how quickly these creatures reproduce. A single xenomorph queen can lay hundreds of eggs. Each egg can produce a facehugger capable of implanting an embryo into any suitable host. Within hours, that embryo develops into a fully grown killing machine, ready to hunt and help establish new nests. In a galaxy where individual worlds contain populations numbering in the billions, the mathematical progression becomes absolutely staggering. The Hive Cities of the Imperium would become perfect breeding grounds. Imagine the Underhive of Necromunda, already a lawless maze of tunnels and abandoned sectors, suddenly infested with xenomorphs. The gangs that rule those depths with crude weapons and primitive tactics would be completely outmatched. Within days, entire levels could fall silent. Within weeks, the infestation could spread upward through the city's countless layers, consuming billions of souls and converting them into hosts for an ever-growing alien army. The Imperial response would be swift and brutal, as it always is when facing Xenos threats. Exterminatus protocols would be activated. Entire worlds would be subjected to cyclonic torpedoes or virus bombs rather than risk the infestation spreading. But here's the terrifying question. Would even these extreme measures be enough? Xenomorphs have demonstrated the ability to survive in the vacuum of space. They can remain dormant for extended periods when conditions are unfavorable. A single survivor, drifting through the void, could potentially restart the entire nightmare on whatever world it eventually reaches. The Space Marine chapters would undoubtedly respond to such a threat with their characteristic determination and tactical brilliance. But even the Emperor's finest warriors would face unprecedented challenges. Xenomorphs are creatures of instinct and perfect biological design. They don't experience fear or doubt. They can't be reasoned with or intimidated. Most importantly, they learn from every encounter, adapting their tactics to overcome whatever strategies the Space Marines employ against them. Consider the psychological impact on Imperial forces. The average Guard regiment is trained to face down horrors that would drive ordinary humans insane. They've learned to stand firm against charging Ork hordes and Tyranid swarms. But Xenomorphs represent a different kind of terror. They're creatures that turn your friends and comrades into weapons against you. Every fallen soldier becomes a potential host for something even worse. The paranoia and mistrust that would spread through Imperial ranks could be almost as devastating as the aliens themselves. The Adeptus Mechanicus would undoubtedly be fascinated by xenomorph biology. Tech priests who spend their lives studying the merger of flesh and machine would see these creatures as the ultimate expression of biological engineering. Some might even attempt to study captured specimens, believing they could unlock secrets that would benefit the Omnissiah's holy work. Such hubris could prove catastrophic, as xenomorphs have consistently demonstrated an ability to escape even the most secure containment measures. The Inquisition would declare the xenomorphs a threat of the highest order. Entire sectors might be placed under quarantine. Inquisitor Lord Exterminatus orders would be prepared for any world showing signs of infestation. But even the Inquisition's vast resources and ruthless efficiency might struggle against an enemy that reproduces exponentially and adapts to every countermeasure deployed against it. Perhaps most intriguingly, we must consider how the forces of chaos would react to this new threat. The Dark Gods feed on emotion and conflict. The terror and desperation generated by a xenomorph infestation would be like a feast for entities such as Khorne and Slaanesh. Some chaos cults might even attempt to weaponize the aliens, believing they could control or direct them toward Imperial targets. Such attempts would almost certainly end in disaster, as xenomorphs recognize no master save their own biological imperatives. The Tyranids present another fascinating dynamic. Here we would have two species designed purely for consumption and reproduction, competing for the same resources. The resulting conflict would be unlike anything the galaxy has ever witnessed. Two perfect killing machines, each evolved for maximum efficiency, locked in a struggle that could potentially consume entire star systems in its wake. As we delve deeper into this scenario, we'll explore exactly how each major faction would respond to this unprecedented threat. We'll examine the tactical advantages and weaknesses that different Imperial organizations would bring to bear against creatures that represent evolution's perfect answer to the question of how to kill and survive. We'll consider whether the combined might of the Imperium could contain such an infestation, or whether the xenomorphs might succeed where countless other Xenos races have failed. The stakes couldn't be higher. In a universe where extinction is always one failed defense away, the introduction of xenomorphs could tip the balance toward absolute catastrophe. But the defenders of humanity have faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious through faith, sacrifice, and the Emperor's protection. The question that haunts this entire scenario is simple yet terrifying. In a galaxy that has survived 10,000 years of endless war, could the Xenomorphs be the final threat that brings it all crashing down? The first recorded encounter happened on mining station Kerberos VII, deep in the Segmentum Tempestus. The Imperial Guard regiment stationed there sent their final transmission at 0347 hours Terran Standard Time. The Vox recording was brief, filled with screaming and the distinctive hiss of atmospheric breach. When the relief fleet arrived 3 weeks later, they found a station operating at full power with life support functioning perfectly. But there were no survivors, no bodies. Just strange, resinous growths coating the walls and corridors that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. The investigating Adeptus Mechanicus team catalogued over 2,000 missing personnel, yet found evidence of something far more disturbing. Biosignatures indicated the presence of organisms that registered as neither fully organic nor mechanical. The tech priests reported readings that defied classification, creatures that seemed to exist in a state between life and death, between natural evolution and artificial enhancement. Within hours of beginning their investigation, the research team went silent. What emerged from that station 3 days later would reshape Imperial understanding of Xenos threats forever. The creatures that had once been human bore only passing resemblance to their former selves. They moved with predatory grace through the void without protective gear, their bodies adapted to environments that would kill unaugmented humans instantly. But most terrifying was their apparent intelligence, their ability to coordinate attacks and adapt to Imperial countermeasures in real time. The Ordo Xenos moved swiftly to contain information about the Kerberos VII incident. Inquisitor Valerius Thorn declared the entire system under emergency quarantine protocols. 3 battle barges of the Iron Hands chapter were dispatched to investigate, their tech marines specifically chosen for their expertise in combating adaptive biological threats. What they discovered would haunt the chapter for centuries to come. The Xenomorphs had not simply killed the station's population, they had transformed them into something infinitely worse. The Iron Hands encountered creatures that displayed enhanced strength and resilience beyond even Space Marine capabilities. These beings retained fragments of Imperial tactical knowledge, while possessing alien instincts that made them nearly impossible to predict or outmaneuver. The chapter's losses were catastrophic, with entire squads disappearing into the station's depths, only to emerge later as twisted amalgamations of Astartes physiology and alien biology. Brother Captain Ferrum Maximus, one of the few survivors of the initial assault, filed a report that would become classified at the highest levels of Imperial command. His account described creatures that seemed to understand Imperial battle doctrine, that could anticipate Space Marine tactics and counter them with terrifying efficiency. Most disturbing was his observation that these beings appeared to retain memories from their host bodies, using intimate knowledge of Imperial procedures and weaknesses against their former brothers. The Iron Hands attempted to establish a beachhead within the station using traditional shock assault tactics. Tactical squads advanced through primary corridors, while Devastator units provided covering fire. The initial breach seemed successful, with minimal resistance encountered in the outer sections, but as they penetrated deeper into the facility, the true horror of their situation became apparent. The aliens had prepared for their arrival, using detailed knowledge of Space Marine combat doctrine to create the perfect killing ground. The corridors themselves had been restructured into a maze of death traps. Acid-resistant resin created false walls that concealed ambush positions. Ventilation systems had been modified to allow rapid movement of creatures that could navigate 3-dimensional space with impossible agility. Most cunningly, the aliens had preserved certain Imperial systems, using them to monitor marine communications and coordinate devastating counterattacks. Brother Sergeant Corvan of the 3rd Tactical Squad reported encountering creatures that spoke High Gothic, using the voices of fallen comrades to lure Marines into carefully prepared ambush sites. The psychological impact proved almost as devastating as the physical casualties. Hardened veterans who had faced down Daemon princes and Tyranid hive tyrants found themselves paralyzed by the sound of dead brothers calling for help from the darkness ahead. The Xenomorphs demonstrated an understanding of Space Marine psychology that suggested they had absorbed more than just physical characteristics from their hosts. They knew exactly how to exploit the bonds of brotherhood that held Astartes squads together. Distress signals from trapped Marines led entire units into carefully orchestrated killing zones. The aliens used the Marines' own sense of duty and loyalty as weapons against them, turning their greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. As the hours passed, the Iron Hands found themselves fighting not just an alien infestation, but a corrupt reflection of their own chapter. Creatures bearing the scarred features of fallen battle brothers stalked them through the station's depths. These abominations retained enough human intelligence to operate captured bolters and chainswords, but their alien instincts made them far more dangerous than any human opponent could ever be. The breaking point came when the Marines encountered what had once been their own chapter master. The creature that emerged from the station's central command hub bore the distinctive iron hands and facial scarring of their revered leader, but its movements possessed an inhuman fluidity that marked it as something utterly alien. When it spoke, using the chapter master's voice to mock their gene father's teachings about the weakness of flesh, several Marines broke ranks entirely. Brother Captain Maximus made the hardest decision of his career. Rather than risk the infestation spreading beyond the station, he ordered immediate withdrawal and prepared to request exterminatus authorization. But even this desperate measure would prove insufficient. As the Iron Hands retreated to their strike cruiser, bioscans detected multiple xenomorph organisms that had somehow infiltrated their vessel during the evacuation. The realization that these creatures could survive in the vacuum of space and apparently breach even Space Marine armor changed everything. Traditional containment protocols meant nothing against organisms that could adapt to any environment and turn any living being into a potential host. The Iron Hands found themselves fighting a running battle through their own ship, as creatures that had once been their battle brothers hunted them through familiar corridors. Tech Marine Brutus attempted to seal off infected sections using emergency bulkheads, but the xenomorphs demonstrated an understanding of Imperial ship design that allowed them to bypass most defensive measures. They used maintenance shafts and service tunnels with the same tactical precision that Space Marines employed in boarding actions. Worse, they seemed to anticipate the Tech Marines' countermeasures, suggesting they retained detailed technical knowledge from their hosts. The surviving Iron Hands managed to reach the ship's chapel, where they made their final stand surrounded by relics of their chapter's greatest victories. The irony was not lost on them that they would likely die in a place dedicated to honoring heroes who had fallen fighting humanity's enemies. But these enemies were different. These had once been their own brothers, corrupted and transformed into something that retained their skills while serving an utterly alien purpose. As dawn broke over the station's observation decks, casting long shadows through the resin-coated corridors, the full scope of the xenomorph threat began to emerge. This was not simply another Xenos species seeking to claim Imperial worlds for their own purposes. These were creatures that could potentially infiltrate and corrupt the Imperium from within, using humanity's own strengths against them in ways that no previous enemy had ever managed. The implications stretched far beyond a single mining station or even a single chapter of Space Marines. If these organisms could adapt so completely to human physiology and psychology, what would happen when they encountered other Imperial institutions? How would the Astra Militarum fare against enemies that possessed their tactical knowledge? What horrors might emerge if these creatures reached the hallowed halls of Terra itself? In the darkness between the stars, something ancient and patient continued its slow expansion across the galaxy, encounter, learning, and adapting with each new. The Vox channels across the sector crackled with fragmentary reports that painted an increasingly dire picture. Imperial Navy patrol vessels reported encounters with unidentified biological signatures moving through the void without any detectable propulsion systems. These contacts appeared on Auspex readings for mere moments before vanishing into the cosmic background, only to reappear in entirely different locations with impossible speed. Fleet commanders initially dismissed these readings as sensor ghosts or warp anomalies, but the pattern of sightings suggested something far more disturbing. Admiral Korath of the Segmentum Tempestus fleet received the first coherent report from Captain Voss of the light cruiser Righteous Fury. The vessel had been conducting routine patrols near the Kerberos system when they detected massive energy signatures emanating from what appeared to be derelict space hulks. These ancient amalgamations of fused starships had drifted through the warp for millennia, accumulating debris and sometimes emerging in real space as potential sources of rare archaeotech or valuable salvage. The Righteous Fury's auger arrays detected life signs within 3 separate hulks, readings that suggested the presence of thousands of organisms in various states of activity. Captain Voss ordered his ship to maintain safe distance, while launching reconnaissance servitors to gather more detailed information. The servo skulls transmitted data for approximately 14 minutes before their signals cut out simultaneously, leaving only static where once there had been steady streams of telemetry. What happened next defied every protocol in the Imperial Navy Codex. The space hulks, previously drifting in predictable trajectories determined by gravitational forces and residual momentum, began to move with clear purpose and coordination. These massive conglomerations of fused metal and twisted architecture, some measuring dozens of kilometers in length, altered course toward inhabited Imperial worlds with precision that suggested active guidance and intelligence. The Righteous Fury attempted to intercept the nearest hulk, bringing their lance batteries to bear on what they assumed were critical structural points. The focused energy beams carved through ancient armor plating and revealed the horrifying truth lurking within. The hulks were no longer simply collections of dead ships bound together by chance and the strange physics of warp translation. They had become something alive, something that pulsed with organic purpose beneath their metal skin. Captain Voss reported seeing movement within the breached sections, masses of organisms that flowed like liquid through the damaged areas, while somehow maintaining cohesion and apparent organization. His description spoke of creatures that seemed to exist in a state between individual entities and collective organisms, moving as both separate beings and unified swarms depending on tactical requirements. The implications sent shockwaves through Imperial command structures that had dealt with every conceivable form of Xenos threat. The first planetary invasion began on Tertius Majoris, an agri-world responsible for feeding 17 neighboring systems. The planet's population of 4 billion souls lived primarily in vast agricultural complexes that stretched across continents, their lives dedicated to producing the grain and protein that kept entire sectors from starvation. The world's defenses consisted of a single PDF regiment and orbital monitoring stations designed to track shipping rather than repel invasion. The Space Hulk entered the system's outer reaches without triggering any of the automated warning systems. Its approach vector suggested natural drift rather than powered flight, a deception that became clear only when the massive construct achieved stable orbit around Tertius Majoris. By then, it was far too late for any meaningful defensive response. The PDF garrison received their first indication of threat when communication arrays across 3 continents went silent simultaneously. Governor Maximilian Vorth ordered immediate investigation of the communication blackout, assuming equipment failure or possible sabotage by dissident elements. The reconnaissance aircraft dispatched to investigate the affected regions transmitted increasingly disturbing reports before losing contact themselves. Pilots spoke of vast areas where the familiar geometric patterns of agricultural installations had been replaced by organic growths that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. The true scope of the disaster became apparent when refugee columns began streaming toward the planet's capital city. Survivors spoke of creatures that moved through the grain fields like liquid shadow, appearing and disappearing with supernatural stealth. These beings seemed to possess an intimate understanding of human behavior, striking at precisely the moments when their victims were most vulnerable and isolated. Worse, they showed clear signs of tactical intelligence, coordinating their attacks to maximize both casualties and terror. The PDF attempted to establish defensive perimeters around major population centers, but their conventional tactics proved utterly inadequate against enemies that could infiltrate any position and strike from unexpected directions. Sentries disappeared from their posts without raising alarms. Entire platoons vanished during routine patrols, leaving behind only scattered equipment and strange organic residues that defied analysis by field Medicae units. Within 72 hours of the first reported contact, Tertius Majoris had effectively fallen to the xenomorph infestation. The creatures had not simply conquered the planet through superior firepower or numbers. They had systematically dismantled the infrastructure of human civilization while simultaneously building something new and utterly alien in its place. The agricultural complexes continued to function, but now they served purposes that no imperial citizen could comprehend or survive witnessing. The distress signals from Tertius Majoris reached Segmentum Command, just as similar reports began flooding in from 17 other systems. The pattern was always the same: ancient space hulks appearing in system peripheries, followed by communication blackouts, then desperate pleas for assistance that cut off abruptly. Each world that fell silent represented billions of Imperial citizens whose fate had become something worse than simple death. Lord Commander Militant Thaddeus Kryn recognized the signs of a coordinated campaign unlike anything in recorded Imperial history. These were not random raids or opportunistic strikes against weakly defended targets. The Xenomorphs were executing a strategic plan that suggested intelligence and foresight far beyond what any previously encountered Xenos species had demonstrated. They seemed to understand Imperial logistics and defensive doctrine with uncomfortable precision. The Space Marine chapters responded to the crisis with characteristic determination, but even the Emperor's finest warriors found themselves facing challenges that strained their legendary adaptability. The Ultramarines' 4th Company, dispatched to investigate the silence from Tertius Majoris, discovered a world that still functioned but no longer served human purposes. The cities remained intact, their power grids operational and transportation networks functioning normally, but they had become something alien and wrong. Captain Titus led his battle brothers through streets that should have been filled with Imperial citizens going about their daily duties. Instead, they found thoroughfares occupied by creatures that moved with purpose but followed no recognizable pattern of behavior. These beings possessed human proportions and occasionally human features, but their movements suggested predatory instincts that had never known civilized restraint. The Ultramarines established their command post in the Planetary Governor's Palace, a structure that remained architecturally unchanged but felt fundamentally wrong in ways that defied rational explanation. The building's corridors echoed with sounds that might have been human voices if heard from a sufficient distance, but closer investigation revealed them to be something else entirely. Something that understood human speech well enough to mimic it for purposes that remained disturbingly unclear. Sergeant Cassius reported that his tactical squad had encountered what appeared to be Imperial Guard uniforms walking through the palace gardens, but the beings wearing them moved with fluid grace that suggested joint structures unlike anything in human anatomy. When challenged, these entities responded with perfect military protocol, giving appropriate passwords and identification codes. Only their eyes betrayed their true nature, reflecting light in patterns that belonged to nocturnal predators rather than human soldiers. The psychological impact on the Space Marines proved almost as challenging as the physical threat. These warriors had trained for centuries to face any enemy the galaxy could produce, but they had never prepared for foes that wore the faces of those they had sworn to protect. Every encounter forced them to choose between tactical prudence and the possibility that they might be firing upon corrupted but potentially savable Imperial citizens. Brother Librarian Tigurius attempted to probe the collective consciousness that seemed to bind these creatures together, seeking to understand their motivations and perhaps find weaknesses that could be exploited. His psychic investigation revealed a vast network of interconnected minds that functioned as both individual entities and collective intelligence. The sheer scope of this mental architecture overwhelmed his considerable abilities, forcing him to withdraw before his own consciousness became absorbed into the alien collective. The revelation that these creatures possessed some form of psychic capability changed the tactical situation entirely. Imperial doctrine for dealing with Xenos psychers was well established, but these beings seemed to operate on principles that existed outside conventional understanding of warp interaction. They showed no signs of corruption by chaos entities, yet their mental abilities suggested connection to forces beyond the material realm. As the Ultramarines continued their investigation, they discovered that the Xenomorphs had not simply conquered Tertius Majoris. They had transformed it into something that operating base for expansion served as both breeding ground and forward into neighboring systems. The agricultural complexes now produced organic materials that bore no resemblance to any known foodstuffs. while the industrial centers manufactured devices that combined biological and mechanical components in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about technology. The manufacturing facilities revealed the true scope of the xenomorph threat. These creatures were not simply another predatory species seeking to consume human worlds for sustenance. They were builders and engineers, capable of creating tools and weapons that surpassed Imperial technology in several crucial areas. Their constructs showed clear understanding of human weaknesses and seemed designed specifically to overcome Imperial defensive measures. Captain Titus made the difficult decision to request immediate exterminatus authorization for Tertius Majoris. The world was beyond salvation, its population either dead or transformed into something that could no longer be considered human. But even this extreme measure might prove insufficient if the xenomorphs had already established similar footholds on other worlds throughout the sector. The request for planetary annihilation worked its way through Imperial bureaucracy with unprecedented speed, reaching the highest levels of segmentum command within hours rather than the usual months or years. The urgency reflected growing recognition that the Imperium faced a threat unlike anything encountered in its 10 millennia of existence. This was not simply another Xenos invasion that could be repelled through superior firepower and tactical doctrine. The xenomorphs represented something far more insidious and dangerous. They were a species that could potentially infiltrate and subvert Imperial civilization from within, using humanity's own strengths and institutions against them. Every world they conquered became a base for further expansion. Every human they captured became a resource for creating even more dangerous hybrid organisms. As exterminatus fleets moved into position around the 17 compromised worlds, Imperial strategists worked desperately to understand the scope of the threat they faced. The xenomorphs had demonstrated capabilities that suggested they possessed detailed knowledge of Imperial procedures and weaknesses. Their coordinated attacks showed tactical sophistication that rivaled or exceeded the best Imperial Guard regiments. The question that haunted every Imperial commander was simple yet terrifying. If these creatures could adapt so completely to human civilization, what other Imperial institutions might already be compromised? How many worlds might harbor sleeper infestations waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves? The paranoia that began spreading through Imperial ranks threatened to become almost as destructive as the aliens themselves. In the darkness between stars, ancient hunger stirred with renewed purpose, having tasted the potential that human civilization offered for its continued evolution and expansion across the galaxy. The exterminatus authorization came through Imperial channels with speed that spoke to the sheer terror these creatures inspired in even the most hardened military commanders. Lord Admiral Spire himself signed the order, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he affixed his seal to documents that would condemn 17 worlds to complete annihilation. The cyclonic torpedoes were already armed and loaded, their machine spirits blessed by tech priests who whispered prayers to the Omnissiah while preparing weapons capable of cracking planetary crusts. But even as the first torpedo bays opened and death descended toward the infected worlds, disturbing reports continued to filter through Imperial communication networks. The xenomorphs were not simply waiting passively for destruction. Long-range Auspex readings detected massive launch signatures from the doomed planets. Streams of biological projectiles hurled into the void with velocities that suggested some form of organic mass driver technology that Imperial scientists could not begin to explain. These living missiles spread throughout each system like spores cast on stellar winds, seeking new worlds to infect with their terrible cargo. Fleet Admiral Corvin watched in horror as his sensor operators tracked thousands of these organic projectiles, each one potentially carrying enough xenomorph genetic material to begin a new infestation wherever it might eventually make planetfall. The mathematics of the situation were absolutely staggering and utterly hopeless. Captain Mordian of the strike cruiser Emperor's Wrath reported that his vessel had intercepted one of these biological projectiles for analysis. The thing measured nearly 50 meters in length and possessed what appeared to be rudimentary guidance systems grown from organic neural networks. When his tech marines attempted to breach its outer shell for examination, the projectile released clouds of microscopic organisms that immediately began attacking the ship's air filtration systems. The contamination spread through the Emperor's Wrath with terrifying efficiency. Within hours, Crew members began reporting strange dreams and compulsions that drew them toward the lower decks where the captured projectile was being held. Those who answered these psychological summons were found days later in various states of biological transformation, their human features slowly giving way to something that combined the worst aspects of xenomorph physiology with retained human intelligence and knowledge. Captain Mordian made the agonizing decision to scuttle his own vessel rather than risk the infection spreading to other ships in his battle group. The strike cruiser's plasma reactors overloaded in a burst of cleansing nuclear fire that could be seen from 3 systems away. But even this sacrifice might have been insufficient, as the explosion scattered debris across a vast area of space, potentially carrying contaminated material to distant worlds that would not discover their doom for decades or centuries to come. The loss of the Emperor's Wrath and her entire crew sent shockwaves through Imperial Navy command structures. If xenomorphs could infiltrate and corrupt even space marine vessels through such minimal contact, traditional containment protocols became meaningless. Every ship that encountered these biological projectiles faced the choice between investigation and potential contamination, or ignorance that might allow the infestation to spread unchecked to populated worlds. Inquisitor Valerius Thorn convened an emergency conclave of his Ordo Xenos colleagues to address the rapidly deteriorating strategic situation. The ancient halls of the inquisitorial fortress on Scintilla echoed with heated debates about response protocols and threat assessment procedures. These were individuals who had spent their entire lives studying and combating alien threats to humanity, yet none could offer precedents for dealing with enemies that seemed to understand Imperial doctrine better than many Imperial officers themselves. The most disturbing aspect of the xenomorph invasion was not their physical capabilities or reproductive efficiency, though both were certainly terrifying enough to warrant extreme response measures. The true horror lay in their apparent ability to absorb and utilize human knowledge, turning Imperial strengths into vulnerabilities and exploiting weaknesses that humanity had never realized it possessed. They fought like space marines when they encountered Astartes, adapted guard tactics when facing Imperial army units, and demonstrated technical knowledge that rivaled the Adeptus Mechanicus when dealing with Imperial technology. Inquisitor Cassandra Vex presented her preliminary analysis of recovered biological samples, though she admitted that her findings raised more questions than they answered. The xenomorph genetic structure appeared to be infinitely adaptable, capable of incorporating beneficial traits from any organism it encountered while discarding unnecessary or detrimental characteristics. But more troubling was evidence suggesting these creatures possessed some form of genetic memory that allowed them to retain and share knowledge across their entire species. This meant that every human they consumed, every Imperial facility they infiltrated, every piece of technology they examined contributed to a growing database of information about human civilization and its weaknesses. The xenomorphs were not simply conquering Imperial worlds through brute force. They were conducting a systematic study of humanity with the apparent goal of achieving perfect adaptation to human environments and defensive capabilities. The implications extended far beyond military considerations. If these creatures could absorb human memories and knowledge, they potentially had access to classified information about Imperial defenses, Space Marine chapter organizations, inquisitorial protocols, and even the location of Terra itself. The security breach represented by their very existence threatened to compromise centuries of careful intelligence work and strategic planning. Brother Captain Thaddeus of the Imperial Fists chapter had been studying tactical reports from the infected systems when he made a connection that chilled even his transhuman physiology. The xenomorph attack patterns showed clear understanding of Imperial tactica principles, but more specifically, they demonstrated knowledge of classified space marine combat doctrines that should have been known only to the Adeptus Astartes themselves. This suggested that the creatures had somehow gained access to information from corrupted space marines, possibly dating back to their initial encounter with the Iron Hands. The realization that xenomorphs could potentially infiltrate space marine chapters represented an existential threat to the Imperium's primary military assets. If these creatures could corrupt the Emperor's finest warriors and turn their knowledge and abilities against humanity, then no Imperial institution could be considered truly secure. The psychological impact on Space Marine morale was almost as devastating as any physical attack could have been. Chapter Master Vladimir Pugh of the Crimson Fists called for an emergency gathering of chapter representatives to address the xenomorph threat. The conclave convened on the fortress world of Rin's world, its ancient halls filled with the greatest heroes of the Adeptus Astartes. These were warriors who had faced down daemon primarchs and hive tyrants, yet the discussion centered on an enemy that many had never actually encountered in direct combat. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about how to address a threat that seemed to violate basic assumptions about Xenos' behavior and capabilities. Traditional Space Marine doctrine emphasized aggressive assault and decisive engagement, but the Xenomorphs had demonstrated an ability to turn such tactics against their users. Some chapters advocated for complete avoidance and reliance on exterminatus protocols, while others argued for careful study to identify exploitable weaknesses. Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists presented the most disturbing intelligence gathered from the fallen worlds. Reconnaissance data suggested that xenomorphs were not simply consuming human populations for biological resources. They appeared to be conducting selective breeding programs, preserving certain individuals for purposes that remained unclear, but were almost certainly related to their apparent desire to understand and adapt to human civilization. The captured humans were being kept alive in what could only be described as biological laboratories, subjected to procedures that combined elements of scientific experimentation with reproductive processes that defied imperial understanding of xenomorph biology. The creatures seemed to be attempting to create hybrid organisms that possessed both human knowledge and alien capabilities, potentially developing new strains specifically designed to infiltrate imperial institutions. These hybrid creatures represented perhaps the greatest threat yet identified. Beings that looked human enough to pass casual inspection, but possessed xenomorph instincts and capabilities, could potentially penetrate any imperial organization. They might serve in the Imperial Guard for years before revealing their true nature, or even rise to positions of authority within planetary governments before beginning their real mission of preparing worlds for full-scale infestation. The paranoia that began spreading through Imperial ranks threatened to become as destructive as the aliens themselves. Officers started viewing their own subordinates with suspicion, wondering if that new recruit might be something other than human. Planetary governors instituted increasingly elaborate screening procedures that slowed military responses and disrupted supply chains. The xenomorphs were achieving strategic objectives simply by existing, forcing the Imperium to divert resources toward internal security rather than external defense. Magos biologist Call of the Adeptus Mechanicus requested permission to study captured xenomorph specimens, arguing that understanding their adaptive mechanisms might lead to countermeasures or even beneficial applications for Imperial technology. The request sparked fierce debate within both the Mechanicus hierarchy and inquisitorial circles, with some arguing that any attempt to study these creatures risked catastrophic contamination of Mars itself. The tech priest's fascination with xenomorph biology was understandable from a purely scientific perspective. These creatures represented biological engineering that surpassed anything achieved by human science, possibly including the Emperor's own genetic manipulation programs that had created the Primarchs. The potential knowledge to be gained from studying such organisms could revolutionize Imperial biotechnology and medical capabilities. But the risks were equally staggering. If xenomorphs cool biology, allowing them anywhere to adapt to and corrupt human technology, as effectively as they seemed to adapt to human near the sacred forges of Mars, could result in the total corruption of humanity's most important technological center. The Fabricator General ultimately denied the request, though rumors persisted that certain tech priests were conducting unauthorized research on recovered xenomorph genetic material. The strategic situation continued to deteriorate as more worlds reported signs of potential infestation. In many cases, these reports came from planetary governments that had maintained normal communications and administrative functions right up until the moment they ceased all contact with Imperial authorities. The pattern suggested that xenomorphs were capable of operating within human societies for extended periods before revealing their presence, potentially gathering intelligence and preparing for coordinated strikes across multiple systems simultaneously. Lord Commander Solar Macharius III convened an emergency session of the High Lords of Terror to address what many were beginning to recognize as the greatest threat to Imperial survival since the Horus Heresy. The ancient chambers beneath the Imperial Palace had witnessed countless debates about military strategy and resource allocation, but never had the participants faced an enemy that seemed to understand their own capabilities and limitations so thoroughly. The discussion revealed the true scope of the crisis facing the Imperium. Xenomorphs were not simply another Xenos species seeking to claim human worlds for their own purposes. They represented a form of biological warfare that attacked the very foundations of Imperial civilization, turning humanity's strengths against itself while adapting to overcome every defensive measure that could be deployed against them. Cardinal Invoker Dolan of the Ecclesiarchy raised theological questions that added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. If these creatures could perfectly mimic human appearance and behavior, how could Imperial citizens distinguish between loyal servants of the Emperor and alien infiltrators? The spiritual implications threatened to undermine the faith that held Imperial society together, potentially causing more damage than any physical invasion could achieve. The meeting concluded with authorization for the most extreme measures in Imperial military doctrine. Entire sectors were placed under total quarantine, with orders to destroy any vessel attempting to leave without proper authorization and biological screening. The Inquisition received unprecedented authority to investigate suspected infestations using any methods deemed necessary. Most significantly, research began on new weapons designed specifically for combating adaptive biological threats. But even as these desperate measures were implemented, disturbing reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy. The Xenomorphs were spreading faster than Imperial forces could respond, and their apparent understanding of human psychology and tactics seemed to improve with each encounter. In the grim darkness of the far future, humanity faced the possibility that it had finally encountered an enemy that could not be defeated through faith and firepower alone. The ancient enemy stirred in the depths between stars, patient as death and hungry as the void itself, having found in humanity not just another species to consume, but the perfect template for its own evolution into something that could dominate the galaxy for eternity. The first signs of systematic infiltration emerged from an unexpected source. Magos biologist Xerath, conducting routine genetic screening protocols on Mars, detected anomalous readings in biological samples submitted by 17 different forge worlds across the segmentum solar. The genetic markers appeared human at first analysis, but deeper examination revealed subtle alterations that suggested exposure to unknown xenobiological agents. These modifications were so precisely integrated into human DNA that they had initially escaped detection by standard Imperial screening procedures. The implications sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of the Adeptus Mechanicus. If xenomorphs are human genetics at such a fundamental level, while developed the capability to alter, leaving their subjects apparently functional and unaware of the changes, then the potential for infiltration extended far beyond anything previously imagined. These modified humans could serve as sleeper agents, carrying dormant xenomorph genetic material that might activate under specific conditions or external stimuli. Fabricator General Belisarius Call personally reviewed Xerath's findings, his augmented consciousness processing the data through multiple analytical frameworks simultaneously. The genetic modifications showed clear signs of intelligent design, suggesting that xenomorphs possessed not only adaptive capabilities, but also sophisticated understanding of human genome structure and function. They were essentially performing genetic engineering at a level that rivaled the Emperor's own Primarch creation programs. The modified humans showed enhanced physical capabilities in several key areas. Their bone density had increased by approximately 30%. Their muscle fiber efficiency had improved dramatically, and their nervous systems displayed reaction times that approached transhuman levels. Most disturbing, brain scans revealed new neural pathways that seemed designed to facilitate some form of external communication or control. These individuals were being prepared for purposes that remained unclear, but were certainly not in humanity's best interests. Cardinal Xenos Thane of the Ordo Xenos arrived on Mars within days of the discovery, bringing with him a strike team of the most experienced xenobiologists in the Inquisition. His investigation revealed that the genetic modifications were not random mutations or crude biological warfare. They represented a systematic program of human enhancement that seemed designed to create a bridge between human and xenomorph physiology, potentially allowing for new forms of hybrid organisms that could function in both biological systems. The enhanced humans were found throughout Imperial society, occupying positions that ranged from factory workers to administrative officials. Their integration into human civilization was so complete that many had families, careers, and social connections spanning decades. They showed no awareness of their altered state and displayed genuine loyalty to the Imperium and the Emperor. This made identification and containment enormously difficult, as there were no behavioral indicators that might reveal their true nature. Inquisitor Thane ordered the immediate and discreet detention of all identified enhanced individuals, a process that required careful coordination to avoid triggering widespread panic. The subjects were transported to specialized containment facilities where they could be studied without risk of contamination or escape. Initial interviews revealed individuals who possessed complete human memories and emotional responses, making them indistinguishable from normal humans except for their genetic modifications. The breakthrough came when one of the detained subjects suddenly collapsed during routine questioning. His body began undergoing rapid physical transformation, his skeletal structure elongating, and his skin taking on the characteristic dark coloration of xenomorph organisms. The change occurred over the course of several hours, during which the subject remained conscious and apparently aware of what was happening to his body, though he seemed powerless to control or stop the process. The transformed individual retained human speech capabilities and memory, but his psychological profile showed dramatic alterations in personality and behavioral patterns. He displayed none of the emotional attachments or moral considerations that had characterized his human persona. Instead, he demonstrated the cold, calculating intelligence typical of xenomorph organisms, viewing his former human existence as merely a useful disguise that had served its purpose and could now be discarded. Under intense interrogation, the transformed subject revealed the true scope of the xenomorph infiltration program. The genetic modifications were designed to remain dormant for extended periods, allowing the carriers to live normal human lives while unknowingly serving as reconnaissance assets. The xenomorphs could access their memories and experiences through some form of genetic communication network, essentially using them as unwitting spies embedded throughout Imperial society. The activation triggers varied depending on the individual's role and location, but generally involved exposure to specific pheromone combinations that could be delivered through atmospheric release or direct contact. Once activated, the transformation process was irreversible and typically completed within 12 to 18 hours. The resulting hybrid organisms retained human knowledge and social connections while possessing xenomorph physical capabilities and instincts. This revelation forced a complete reassessment of Imperial security protocols. If xenomorphs could create sleeper agents that remained undetectable for years or decades, then any Imperial citizen might potentially be a threat. The paranoia that had been growing within military circles now spread throughout civilian populations as communities began viewing their neighbors with suspicion and fear. Social cohesion, one of the Imperium's greatest strengths, began to fracture under the weight of mutual distrust. Governor Militant Helga Voss of the Cadian shock troops received emergency orders to implement new screening procedures for all military personnel under her command. The process involved genetic testing that could identify the subtle markers associated with xenomorph modification, but the procedures were time-consuming and required sophisticated laboratory equipment that was not readily available on most worlds. The delay in implementing comprehensive screening left military units vulnerable to potential infiltration for months. The first confirmed case of military infiltration occurred within the ranks of the Vostroyan Firstborn Regiment stationed on the fortress world of Casa d'Earth. Sergeant Major Boris Khrushchev, a decorated veteran with 30 years of distinguished service, underwent spontaneous transformation during a routine training exercise. His change occurred in full view of his entire platoon, traumatizing soldiers who had served under his command for years and trusted him with their lives. The transformed Khrushchev displayed tactical knowledge that allowed him to anticipate and counter every move his former subordinates made during the subsequent containment effort. He used intimate knowledge of guard doctrine and unit organization to create maximum chaos and confusion, exploiting weaknesses in standard Imperial protocols that he had helped develop and implement during his human years. The casualties were severe, with entire squads falling to an enemy that understood their training better than they did themselves. Colonel Dmitry Volga managed to contain the situation by ordering concentrated lasgun fire that eventually overwhelmed the hybrid's enhanced physiology, but not before it had transmitted valuable intelligence to unknown recipients through some form of biological communication system. The creature's death revealed internal organs that combined human and xenomorph characteristics in ways that defied medical understanding, suggesting biological engineering capabilities that surpassed anything in Imperial scientific knowledge. The Volga incident sparked immediate investigations into potential infiltration of other guard regiments throughout the sector. The screening process revealed dozens of additional cases, forcing military commanders to question the loyalty and reliability of soldiers who had previously been considered above suspicion. Unit cohesion began to break down as troops became reluctant to trust their comrades, undermining the bonds of brotherhood that had traditionally made Imperial Guard formations so effective. Space Marine chapters faced even more severe challenges, as their enhanced physiology made genetic screening procedures significantly more complex. The interaction between Astartes' gene seed and potential xenomorph modifications created new variables that Imperial scientists struggled to understand. Brother Apothecary, Lysander of the Imperial Fists, developed new testing protocols specifically designed for space marine biology, but the procedures required extensive analysis that could take weeks to complete for each individual. The delayed results created operational difficulties for chapters that needed to maintain combat readiness while ensuring the loyalty of their battle brothers. Some chapters implemented buddy system protocols where no Marine operated alone, while others established rotating assignments that prevented any individual from gaining too much operational knowledge or authority. These measures improved security, but reduced tactical flexibility and efficiency in ways that could prove costly during actual combat operations. Chapter Master Kalgar of the Ultramarines convened a special conclave to address the infiltration threat, specifically as it related to Space Marine chapters. The gathering included apothecaries and librarians from across the Imperium, individuals whose expertise in genetics and psychic phenomena might provide insights into xenomorph capabilities and potential countermeasures. The discussions revealed the full complexity of the threat facing the Adeptus Astartes. The xenomorphs had apparently developed specific techniques for infiltrating space marine recruitment processes, targeting potential aspirants during their selection trials. Young candidates who possessed the genetic compatibility necessary for successful gene seed implantation were ideal subjects for modification, as their enhanced physiology could better accommodate the complex biological changes required for xenomorph integration. These compromised recruits could potentially serve undetected for decades or even centuries before receiving activation signals. Brother Librarian Tigurius presented psychic reconnaissance data that revealed disturbing information about xenomorph collective consciousness capabilities. The creatures seemed to share information through some form of biological network that operated independently of warp-based communication methods. This meant that knowledge gained by one organism could be instantly available to others across vast distances, creating a hive mind effect that allowed for unprecedented coordination of infiltration and sabotage efforts. The psychic network also explained how xenomorphs could maintain such detailed knowledge of Imperial procedures and weaknesses. Every successful infiltration provided them with additional information that became immediately available to their entire species. They were essentially conducting a galaxy-wide intelligence-gathering operation that grew more comprehensive with each new victim they converted or facility they compromised. Inquisitor Lord Cotiers authorized the formation of specialized hunter-killer teams designed specifically for identifying and eliminating xenomorph infiltrators. These units combined the investigative skills of inquisitorial agents with the combat capabilities of Space Marine kill teams, creating forces that could both detect threats and respond to them with overwhelming firepower. The teams received extensive training in xenomorph biology and behavior patterns, though much of their knowledge was based on speculation and limited field experience. The hunter-killer teams achieved several early successes, identifying and eliminating infiltrator cells on 12 different worlds before they could complete their activation sequences. However, these victories came at a significant cost, as the teams often had to operate in populated areas where collateral damage was unavoidable. Entire city blocks were sometimes subjected to purification protocols to ensure complete elimination of xenomorph genetic material, resulting in civilian casualties that numbered in the millions. The civilian population's response to these extreme measures varied greatly depending on local conditions and leadership. Some worlds accepted the necessity of harsh security measures, understanding that the alternative might be total extinction. Others experienced civil unrest as citizens protested what they perceived as excessive and arbitrary persecution by imperial authorities. The social fabric of entire sectors began to strain under the pressure of constant suspicion and periodic purification operations. Cardinal Invoker Malachi of the Ecclesiarchy issued official guidance to help imperial citizens understand their duty during the xenomorph crisis. His proclamations emphasized that vigilance against alien infiltration was a sacred obligation to the emperor, and that reporting suspicious behavior was an act of religious devotion rather than mere paranoia. The theological justification helped maintain social order in many areas, though it also contributed to an atmosphere of mutual surveillance that fundamentally altered the character of imperial society. The economic impact of the infiltration crisis began to manifest as trade routes were disrupted by extensive security screening procedures. Merchant vessels faced delays of weeks or months, while their crews underwent genetic testing and psychological evaluation. Supply chains that had operated efficiently for centuries suddenly became unreliable, forcing entire sectors to implement rationing protocols typically reserved for wartime conditions. The Adeptus Mechanicus developed automated screening systems designed to process large numbers of individuals more efficiently, but these devices proved vulnerable to sabotage by infiltrators who understood their operating principles. Several Forge worlds reported the discovery of compromised screening equipment that had been programmed to provide false negative results for xenomorph-modified subjects, potentially allowing hundreds or thousands of infiltrators to pass undetected through security checkpoints. The sabotage of screening the new equipment represented a level of sophistication in xenomorph operations, suggesting that they had developed specific countermeasures for imperial defensive technologies. This adaptive capability meant that security procedures would need constant updating and modification to remain effective. Creating a technological arms race between human defenders favored the more adaptable xenomorph organisms and alien infiltrators that heavily. Tech Priest Dominus Call initiated a classified research project aimed at developing new detection methods that would be more difficult for xenomorphs to compromise or circumvent. His work focused on quantum-level genetic analysis techniques that could identify xenomorph modifications even when they were designed to mimic human genetic patterns perfectly. The research required resources and expertise from multiple Forge worlds, making it one of the largest collaborative projects in Mechanicus history. As the infiltration crisis deepened, Imperial commanders began to realize that they were fighting an enemy that possessed advantages beyond anything previously encountered. The xenomorphs combined physical superiority with strategic intelligence, adaptive capabilities with long-term planning, and individual initiative with collective coordination. They represented evolutionary perfection applied to the specific task of conquering and replacing human civilization. The psychological pressure of constant vigilance began to take its toll on Imperial personnel at every level. Veteran officers who had commanded through decades of warfare found themselves paralyzed by the possibility that their most trusted subordinates might be alien infiltrators. The bonds of loyalty and brotherhood that held Imperial forces together were gradually being eroded by suspicion and fear, potentially achieving the xenomorphs' strategic objectives without requiring direct military confrontation. In the depths of space, ancient hunger continued its patient work, weaving threads of corruption through the fabric of human civilization while preparing for the final phase of an invasion that would transform the galaxy forever. The revelation that xenomorphs could manipulate Imperial communication networks marked a terrifying evolution in their capabilities. Tech-adept Varian of the Astropathic Choir on Macragge first noticed the anomaly during routine message processing. Psychic transmissions that should have carried standard military reports instead contained subtle alterations that seemed designed to misdirect Imperial forces and create gaps in defensive coverage. The changes were so skillfully integrated into legitimate communications that they had gone undetected for months. The scope of the communication infiltration became clear when Varian cross-referenced message logs from 17 different astropathic stations across 3 sectors. The pattern revealed a coordinated campaign to manipulate information flow throughout Imperial command structures. False reports diverted Space Marine strike forces away from critical locations, while fabricated intelligence reports created phantom threats that consumed valuable resources, chasing non-existent enemies. Most disturbing was the discovery that the xenomorphs had somehow learned to influence astropathic communications through biological means rather than psychic manipulation. They were producing organic compounds that could interfere with the neural pathways used by sanctioned psychers, essentially Hige Imperium's stacking the secure communication methods. The implications suggested technological sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about alien capabilities. Master of the Astropathic Choir Valdris convened an emergency conclave of senior telepaths to address the communication crisis. The ancient chambers beneath the Imperial Palace filled with psychers, whose minds had been trained to pierce the veil between dimensions, yet they found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to understand their abilities better than they did themselves. The xenomorphs were not simply disrupting communications. They were actively participating in Imperial information networks while remaining completely undetected. The telepaths reported experiencing strange sensations during message transmission, brief moments when their psychic consciousness seemed to brush against something vast and utterly alien. These encounters were so fleeting that they had initially been dismissed as normal warp turbulence, but closer analysis revealed patterns that suggested deliberate contact by non-human intelligence. The xenomorphs were essentially eavesdropping on every psychic communication in the Imperium. Brother Captain Thaddeus of the Blood Angels received orders that exemplified the crisis facing Imperial forces. His strike force was directed to respond to an urgent distress call from the mining world of Xerion Prime, where reportedly massive Ork incursions threatened to overrun the planetary defense forces. The deployment required his entire company, along with significant naval support, representing a major commitment of Space Marine resources to what appeared to be a routine Xenos suppression mission. The Blood Angels arrived at Xerion Prime to find a world that showed no signs of Ork infestation. The planetary population was going about their normal activities, mining operations were proceeding on schedule, and the PDF reported no contact with any hostile forces. The distress call had been completely fabricated, drawing valuable Imperial assets away from their actual assignments while leaving other sectors vulnerable to real threats. As Thaddeus investigated the false alarm, his battle brothers discovered evidence of xenomorph presence in the planet's communication facilities. The organic growths they found were unlike anything previously documented, resembling neural networks that had been integrated directly into Imperial communications equipment. These biological components were actively monitoring and manipulating all incoming and outgoing transmissions while remaining virtually invisible to standard detection methods. The xenomorphs had essentially turned Imperial communication networks into extension of their own collective consciousness. Every message transmitted through compromised systems provided them with additional intelligence about Imperial operations, troop movements, and strategic planning. They were conducting comprehensive surveillance of human civilization while simultaneously manipulating it to serve their own purposes. Tech priest Dominus Vex attempted to purge the biological contamination from Xerion Prime's communication systems, but the organic components had integrated themselves so thoroughly with Imperial technology that removal would require complete replacement of all affected equipment. The process would take months and leave the world isolated from Imperial command networks during a period when coordination was absolutely critical for survival. The communication crisis forced Imperial commanders to reconsider their entire approach to military coordination. Traditional command structures that relied on rapid information sharing suddenly became potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by enemies who understood Imperial doctrine better than many Imperial officers. New protocols required multiple confirmation sources for all major decisions, significantly slowing response times during critical situations. Admiral Spire of Battlefleet, Gothic faced the impossible challenge of maintaining fleet operations while ensuring communication security. His vessels needed constant coordination to maintain effective patrol patterns and respond to emerging threats. But every transmission potentially provided xenomorphs with valuable intelligence about Imperial naval capabilities and deployment strategies. The solution required implementing complex encryption protocols that significantly reduced communication efficiency. The encrypted communications proved partially effective against xenomorph infiltration, but the organic components they had integrated into Imperial systems demonstrated disturbing adaptive capabilities. Within weeks of the new protocol's implementation, evidence suggested that the aliens were already developing countermeasures. Their biological networks began producing different compounds designed to overcome the encryption methods. Engaging Imperial cryptographers in a technological arms race, they were poorly equipped to win. Inquisitor Valerius Thorn recognized that the communication infiltration represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the xenomorph threat. These creatures were not simply another predatory species seeking to consume human worlds. They were conducting a systematic campaign to understand and subvert Imperial civilization from within, using humanity's own communication networks as weapons against them. The strategic implications extended far beyond any single world or sector. The Inquisition implemented new security measures that required all sensitive communications to be delivered through multiple redundant channels, with human couriers used for the most critical information. These procedures provided better security against xenomorph infiltration, but created massive logistical challenges for an organization that depended on rapid information flow to function effectively. Many inquisitorial operations were delayed or compromised by communication difficulties. Brother Librarian Mephiston of the Blood Angels attempted to trace the source of the communication infiltration using his considerable psychic abilities. His investigation led him through layers of biological networking that spanned multiple star systems, revealing the true scope of xenomorph information gathering operations. The aliens had established a galaxy-spanning surveillance network that monitored Imperial activities with unprecedented precision and detail. The psychic reconnaissance revealed that xenomorphs were not simply reacting to Imperial actions, but were actively predicting and preparing for future human responses. Their collective intelligence allowed them to analyze vast amounts of data and identify patterns that enabled them to anticipate Imperial strategic decisions with disturbing accuracy. They were essentially conducting warfare on a temporal level, fighting battles before Imperial commanders even realized conflicts had begun. The predictive capabilities explained how xenomorphs had achieved such remarkable success in their initial expansion phase. They were not simply overwhelming Imperial defenses through superior numbers or individual capability. They were outmaneuvering human forces strategically by understanding Imperial doctrine better than its practitioners and anticipating countermeasures before they could be implemented effectively. Cardinal Xenos Thane authorized the creation of specialized communication units designed to operate independently of standard Imperial networks. These teams used archaic methods including written messages and mechanical signal devices that could not be easily compromised by biological infiltration. The approach provided better security but reduced communication speed to levels that had not been seen since before the development of astropathic networks. The return to primitive communication methods had unexpected consequences for Imperial military effectiveness. Units that had become accustomed to instant coordination suddenly found themselves operating with the communication delays that had characterized warfare in earlier eras. Many commanders struggled to adapt their tactical approaches to account for the information lag, resulting in coordination failures that xenomorphs were quick to exploit. Magos Biologis Call's research into xenomorph communication capabilities revealed disturbing information about their collective intelligence structure. The creatures appeared to share not only information, but also analytical capabilities, creating a distributed processing network that could solve complex problems faster than any individual human mind or even cogitator systems. They were essentially functioning as a single vast intelligence distributed across thousands or millions of individual organisms. The distributed intelligence explained how xenomorphs could coordinate such complex infiltration operations across multiple star systems simultaneously. Each organism served as both sensor and processor, gathering information and contributing to collective analysis while receiving strategic guidance from the network as a whole. The result was a form of collective consciousness that combined individual initiative with centralized coordination in ways that no human organization could match. The xenomorph communication network also demonstrated the ability to adapt and evolve in response to imperial countermeasures. When encryption protocols were implemented, the network began developing biological solutions that could overcome them. When communication channels were severed, alternative pathways emerged through previously undetected biological connections. The aliens were conducting a form of evolutionary warfare that allowed them to improve their capabilities continuously. Tech Priest Varian discovered that xenomorph biological networks were not limited to communication functions. The organic components integrated into Imperial systems were also capable of manipulating other technologies, including power distribution networks, atmospheric control systems, and even weapon targeting arrays. The aliens were essentially gaining remote control access to critical Imperial infrastructure through biological means that standard security measures could not detect or prevent. The infrastructure infiltration represented a new level of threat that forced complete reconsideration of Imperial defensive strategies. If xenomorphs could control power grids and life support systems remotely, traditional fortress approaches became meaningless. They could potentially shut down planetary defenses or create environmental disasters that would force evacuation of entire world-station. So what have we discovered in this nightmare scenario? The xenomorphs wouldn't simply be another Xenos threat for the Imperium to crush with overwhelming firepower. They would represent something far more insidious and terrifying, an enemy that learns, adapts, and turns humanity's greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. Their ability to infiltrate every aspect of Imperial society while evolving beyond any countermeasure makes them perhaps the one threat that could finally bring down 10 millennia of human dominance. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the galaxy's most perfectly evolved killers might find their match in creatures that exist solely to hunt, reproduce, and consume everything in their path.